and welcome to the Literature Cafe. Today we are diving into the world of white-collar workers because in 1930, during the Weimar Republic, the film theorist Siegfried Kracauer published a sociological study called the Salaried masses, and in it he focused on this then fairly new professional group. So people working in sleek suits in modern Berlin offices who had this firm belief that they had absolutely nothing, like really nothing in common with the blue-collar workers in their overworlds. But Kracauer saw this as a huge misconception, and by capturing snapshots of Berlin office life at the time, eavesdropping on everyday conversations in department stores and cinemas, and looking into how these employees spent their free time, he tried to paint a detailed picture of their mindset. And what he concluded was that these employees had a completely false perception of their own situation. In reality, they were in the same boat as the manual laborers. They just didn't want to admit it. And he even went so far as to say that while they aspired to a bourgeois lifestyle, they failed to see that they were in truth the new proletariat of the office world. And guess who read Kracauer's analysis? None other than the writer Hans Fallada. And he thought, okay, there's something in this. And he turned this into the sociological study, into the well-known novel Little Man, What Now? And in this book, Fallada explores the existential anxieties of the little man Johannes Pinneberg, who more or less stands as a representative of the commercial employee class. And I have to say, throughout my reading, I really grew incredibly fond of him, with all his doubts, his young family trying to make it right, and this constant question of how on earth he's supposed to stay afloat in this big city during the Great Depression, when his entire existence is completely out of his hands. So it's a truly novel filled with reliving characters, and while overall the world and the conditions it describes are anything but cheerful, I have to admit that because these characters felt so close and so lovable, I was actually really sad when I reached the last page. Little Man, What Now? So what's the book actually about? Fallada tells the story of Johannes Pinneberg, a clerk, and his wife Emma, whom he calls Lämmchen, during the last years of the Weimar Republic. And the novel follows this young couple who don't have any real savings or influence as they struggle more and more under growing economic pressures. And they are expecting their first child, whom they lovingly call Merkel, always slowly getting crushed by the harsh social and financial realities of that time. And the book is divided into different sections, showing Pinneberg's professional and also his personal downfall. And it all starts with a kind of prologue called The Carefree Ones. And at this point, Pinneberg is still working as a bookkeeper at the grain and fertilizer company. But when his boss tries unsuccessfully to set him up with his own daughter, it comes out that Pinneberg is already married to Lämmchen, and that gets him fired. And after losing his job, Pinneberg's mother invites him and Lämmchen to Berlin. And at the time, Berlin was in this economic crisis with massive unemployment everywhere. But through some personal connections, he managed to get a job as a menswear salesman at the department store Mandel. And at first, things actually go okay for Pinneberg. He manages to hold his own at the store, but then Mandel starts tightening things up, introducing efficiency measures and strict sales quotas. So Pinneberg struggles to meet the targets, the pressure mounts, and eventually he's let go again, pushed straight into unemployment. And that's actually the pattern of the book. Pinneberg keeps running into situations that make him realize just how badly you're treated when you have no money, how powerless you are when you depend on a job at the mercy of those who have control over you. But despite this downward spiral, despite this increasing poverty and desperation, Fallada creates characters who, even in the worst of times, try to hold on to their integrity and find happiness in as a small family, right up until they hit rock bottom when there's really no reason left to hope anymore.
The Bourgeois Illusion.
And the main theme of the novel is the concept of the employee class. So basically the class of white-collar workers which emerged in the 1920s. And this class is contrasted with the working class. But the thing is, it's a class that doesn't really see itself as a class. And that's exactly what Pinneberg gets criticized for right at the beginning of the novel, when he visits his father-in-law, Mr. Merschel, so the father of Lämmchen. And Lämmchen comes from a working-class family. And in this scene, you can really see how workers back then, influenced by Marx's understanding of their own situation, knew the rights and understood that they had to fight for them collectively and in solidarity. And that's exactly what Mr. Merschel criticizes about employees like Pinneberg, that this sense of solidarity, this awareness of their own position is completely missing among them. And at one point, the father says to Pinneberg, "Because you're not organized, your employees," Mr. Merschel explains, "because there is no cohesion among you, no solidarity, and that's why they do whatever they want with you." "Employee, when I hear that word," says Merschel, "you think you're better than us workers." "I don't think that." "Yes, you do. And why? Because instead of getting paid weekly like us, you defer your wages for a whole month, because you work unpaid overtime, because you earn below standard wages, because you never go on strike, because you're always the strike breakers." And here Mr. Merschel is accusing Pinneberg of not standing up for his rights, of not fighting for better wages and paid overtime like the workers do. Because workers had been organizing into unions since the mid-19th century, and through labor struggles they managed to improve their working conditions, securing better wages and paid overtime. But since employees like Pinneberg have this individualized perspective, they don't feel any sense of solidarity with their fellow employees. And that's why, according to Merschel, they have no one to blame but themselves for their situation, and they let everything happen to them without resistance. So you can really see these two different groups clashing here, and both looking down on each other, both standing in opposition. But as the novel goes on, it becomes more and more clear that Kracauer's thesis, so the one I mentioned earlier, that workers and employees actually share the same fate, holds true. Because you have to remember and have to know that Kracauer had somewhat Marxist perspective as well, because which he saw things this way. Because back when Marx wrote Capital, society was essentially divided into two groups. So workers who sold their labor and capitalists who owned the means of production. But now with the emergence of employees, things had changed. Employees didn't see themselves as part of the working class anymore, because they were doing intellectual labor, so working in clean office environments like the capitalists, instead of getting their hands dirty. So they saw themselves as part of the upper ranks. And that's exactly why Kracauer described the employees as spiritually homeless. They are trapped in their individual struggles and don't truly belong anywhere. They are not part of the upper bourgeoisie, which enjoys economic security and stability either through inherited wealth or an established tradition of education. But at the same time, they also don't feel connected to the workers either. Still, they aspire to that bourgeois lifestyle, dressing well, consuming culture and entertainment, at least to maintain the appearance of a better life. But in reality, economically, they are just as insecure as workers. They live with the same existential fears and depend just as much on selling their labor to survive. And that's why they are sometimes called the white-collar proletariat. So the only real difference is cultural, how they spend their free time, how they present themselves. And that's what separates them from the workers. And Pinneberg even says at one point, it's not just about the money, says Pinneberg. We also think differently than most workers. We have different needs. And this becomes even more apparent when Pinneberg spends his first paycheck at Mandels to buy Lämmchen a dressing table. And honestly, I found that really sweet at first, because Pinneberg always thinks about Lämmchen's happiness, how he can make her feel special. But at the same time, this dressing table also symbolizes one of the novel's central themes: the desire for prosperity, for a better life, and that dream that things will eventually improve, even though for most it remains just a dream. And because realistically, with his employee salary, Pinneberg can hardly afford something like that. The dressing table alone eats up almost the entire monthly paycheck. Economic desperation and everyday survival. And you can really tell from the novel, especially when you look at Pinneberg's financial situation, that he's not actually much better off than the workers. And this sense of insecurity runs through the whole book. Pinneberg and Lämmchen are struggling every month to make rent, counting every mark, keeping a strict household budget, and they're constantly wondering if they can even afford a piece of meat or if they have to cut back somewhere else. And that gives the novel this almost dreadful quality. And the way the novel tells its story has this sort of reportage style, and the language, it's really simple, really accessible, pulls you in close to the characters' everyday lives. So you really feel you're right there with them, hearing how they actually talk with all their casual expressions and dialects. Because at the end of the day, these employees, they're not intellectuals, and true to the era of new objectivity, the narrator just lays everything out for you, totally neutral, no judgment, just showing you exactly what's there. And that gives you as a reader this incredibly detailed and realistic perspective on what's being described. And this style of storytelling, it really gets into the nitty-gritty, like when it goes into detail about how they put together their household budget, meticulously figuring out where they can cut corners, what they really need, what they can go without. And it's all described with this almost obsessive attention to detail, how these financial worries, this constant feeling of helplessness, shape their everyday thought, every action, every emotion. And I actually gave the book to a friend to read, and he's in a pretty comfortable financial situation, and he went like, this is boring, like why should I care about shopping lists and worries of some other random little guy, what am I supposed to get out of this? And honestly, I think that's actually the point. That's what makes the novel, what the novel is supposed to make you feel. Because unlike so many other books, this one isn't about some wealthy protagonist or a classic hero. It's about an everyday hero, someone who represents the reality of the majority of people. And reality is brutal then and now, because for most people life isn't about grand adventures. It's about wondering if you can even afford to have friends over, or if you don't even have enough left for a train ticket. Maybe you just barely scrape by cutting costs here and there, and then maybe there's just a tiny bit left over to go out once in a while and have a little fun. And those are the worries that so many people live with, but nobody really talks about them, even though they shape entire lives and ways of living. And that's why I actually found the book so fascinating to read, especially because Fallada captures all of this in such a creative way. And I didn't find it boring at all. If anything, I was completely caught up in it, rooting for this little family, hoping things would get better for them, hoping for some tiny miracle that might help them out. And sure, their situation just keeps getting worse. Their living conditions go downhill. Their hopes of moving up in the world through office work slowly fade, and in the end disappear completely, both for Pinneberg and for so many other employees of this time. Political disillusionment. And because of this almost documentary-like style, you get an incredibly deep understanding of how unemployment, the situation of employees during economic fluctuations, and politics all connect. So through this novel, you actually learn a lot about the economic system too. And it becomes very clear that the lack of collective voice is exactly what allows employers to treat employees however they want, because they don't form a united front. And you can definitely see parallels to today. And because the book takes place just before Hitler came to power, so during a time that was heavily influenced by fascists and right-wing movement. And a big reason for that, of course, was the mass unemployment and precarious conditions. And there's also this scene where Lämmchen says she wants to vote for the Communist Party, and then she says to Pinneberg, "I know what we are voting for." "Well, and what? Communists?" "Of course." Let's think about that," says Pinneberg. "I always wanted to, but then I can't bring myself to do it. For the time being, we still have positions, so it's not necessary yet." So for Pinneberg, things aren't bad enough yet to vote for communists. He still has a job after all. He thinks the left party is only for those who really struggle, the unemployed, and he refuses to see that he's actually in the same boat. And honestly, I think that's still a huge issue today, right? Left-wing parties struggle so much with middle-class, better-paid employees because a lot of time employees don't even realize which political movement actually represents them or what their real interests even are. Instead, they see themselves as part of the upper middle class and often vote for liberal parties because they think they belong to the higher ranks of society. And in doing so, they completely overlook the fact that it's the left-wing parties that fight for the rights of people who sell their labor, and that includes employees too. So what happens is this strange kind of pride in a status they don't even have, and it ends up holding them back. Instead of looking up and realizing they're actually fighting the wrong enemy, if you want to put it that way, they distance themselves from those who are below them and end up punching down instead. You can see this in the whole debate, especially in recent years, about how the unemployed are supposedly a burden on society. There's this constant push to direct people's frustration towards the weakest, making it seem like they're contributing nothing, but at the same time you barely ever hear any criticism of those who just sit on inherited wealth and don't lift a finger. And honestly, I find that absolutely absurd. Corporate control over private life. And now I'd like to read a slightly longer passage from the book, and this scene takes place in the Mandel department store where Pinneberg works as a men's clothing salesman, and he witnesses a colleague being reprimanded by her superior because she was apparently caught having a relationship with a colleague from another department. And it says, "That is a mistake on your part, Fräulein. The Mandel department store feeds and clothes you. The Mandel department store makes your very existence possible. You are expected to put the Warenhaus Mandel first in everything you do. You meet in a hotel, you can be seen there by any customer. For the customer, it's awkward. For you, it's awkward. For the company, it's a loss. You could, since we are allowed to speak openly, end up in a certain situation. By law, we would then have to continue employing you. Another loss, the salesman would have to pay alimony. His salary wouldn't be enough. He'd have constant worries. His sales would suffer. Another loss. You have acted so seriously," says Mr. Spanfuß with emphasis, "against the interests of the House of Mandel, that we." A new long pause. Miss Fisher remained silent. Then Mr. Lehman quickly adds, "Since you have acted against the interest of the company, we are entitled to dismiss you without any notice." So what we see here is that not only is the employee's labor owned by the company, but their entire life as well. And this strongly resembles a form of ideological control, making it clear just how much they exploit the fact that an employee is completely dependent on their employers and their salary. So the employee is supposed to believe that their very existence depends entirely on the well-being of the company. And yet, just as we see here, they are just as replaceable as any other worker, utterly powerless in the face of the system. And what's striking is that this replaceability, this possibility is demonstrated in the most arbitrary and ruthless way. It's not just about giving everything to the company during working hours. You're also expected to present a flawless image outside of work, because any form of negative attention is undesirable. And that what makes this so absurd, because when I walk into a department store, I don't care what the employees do in their private lives, but for their company, it apparently damages its image if its workers don't align their personal choices with the company's interests. So this demand is total, and you can observe how many people, even outside of work, behave as if they are being watched by their boss, even when no one is watching, because they are at all times a functionary, a representative of the company, even outside of their working hours. And then later, Pinneberg himself gets a reprimand after his child is born and his life undergoes significant changes. He arrives late to work one day, and then his boss tells him, "You are half an hour late again today. I suppose you expect us to believe you don't give a damn about the house of Mandel." "I beg your pardon, Mr. Spanfuss. My child got sick last night. I had to find a nurse." "Oh, so your child this time," Mr. Spanfuss says. "4 weeks ago. Or was it 10? It was your wife. Next time I assume it will be your grandmother, and after that maybe your aunt will break her leg. You seem to overestimate how much the company cares about your private affairs. The House of Mandel is not interested in your personal life. Kindly handle your problems outside of business hours. The company is what makes your private life possible, sir. First comes the company, then the company again, and then once more the company. Only after that may you do whatever you please. You live off us. We have taken your livelihood, and yet somehow you always manage to be on time when it's payday." And I have to say, there's a certain brutal honesty to it that almost makes it likable, because at the end of the day, that's exactly how it is. The company doesn't care about your private life or who you are as a person, as long as your contracted working hours are in effect. So you don't belong to yourself, you belong to the company. And after all, a company isn't paying for a person, it's paying for time. And the moment a company manages to convince its employees that they actually owe something to the company, that's when the perfect ideology is born, because suddenly no one even stops to think about the fact that it's actually the employee who generates the value. The employee is the one the company depends on, and not the other way around. And at that moment, I immediately thought of Gregor Samsa from Kafka's Metamorphosis. So, you know, the guy who literally turns into a trapped creature, completely powerless in the face of his boss, totally consumed by his job. And honestly, it's no wonder people end up in an identity crisis, completely lost, when all they do is constantly being forced to think about how to act in the perfect interest of their employer. When is there even time left to develop a sense of self, like to figure out personal interests or to actually have a personality of your own? Because during work, you're functioning for 8, 9, 10 hours purely in service of the company, and after work, you're like between eating, sleeping, and maybe a bit of rest, there's barely enough time left for yourself. And the weekend, well, more often than not, you're still expected to be reachable or to do some kind of training, and of course, all for the benefit of the company. So honestly, the only thing that could maybe make your work enjoyable is our supportive colleagues. So but Pinneberg actually realizes that it's actually not about lifting each other up. It's rather more about that everyone is dragging each other down. devotion of workplace solidarity. And so there's hardly any real sense of friendliness or politeness among colleagues. So instead, it's more of a kiss up, kick down environment. And the only real friendship Pinneberg experiences is with Heilbut, so who's always there for him, supporting him, stand by his side like a true companion. But even so, he suffers under the constant harassment from his superiors. And it's not just the tension between the bosses and the employees that's so extreme, it's also the way the employees treat each other. So there's so much competition, so much backstabbing, that any sense of shared class solidarity is pretty much impossible. And a big part of this has to do with the so-called efficiency measures that were introduced when quotas were implemented at the Mandel's department store. So to enforce this, they brought in an outside consultant named Spanfuß, who was convinced that productivity could only be increased if employees were motivated to sell more. And his idea for that was that every employee had to meet any certain sales target, and if you didn't, you were out. And today you'd call these quotas KPIs, so ways to make employee performance measurable, so to push them into thinking like entrepreneurs and to make the company's goals feel like their own. And of course, these quotas and performance targets turned the entire workforce against each other, creating a constant state of competition. Everyone was judged by their numbers, knowing full well that their job depends on whether they hit those targets. And naturally, this creates an insane amount of pressure. And that exactly what makes the novel so clear, is that systems like these, through things like internal benchmarking, push employees to the absolute limit. And this creates an environment where real solidarity between workers is almost impossible. It just fuels this ruthless mentality. So people start trying to steal customers from each other, spreading lies, rumors, anything to push someone else out just to stay employed maybe a little bit longer themselves. And this really drives home an important point, because in many industries it's not, like people often claim, just about greed or narcissism when employees act ruthlessly or take big risks, like in the financial sector. It's actually the reality that the so-called efficiency measures put them under such intense pressure that they have no choice to look out for themselves. And in fact, for Pinneberg, the quota system actually makes him perform worse, because he's so desperate to sell, and anyone who ever dealt with a pushy salesperson knows that this kind of pressure just makes you not want to buy anything at all. And on top of that, his boss keeps throwing out lines like, oh, you haven't sold much this week. Are you even trying? Or are you slacking off? Your colleagues are saying more than you. And they keep hammering in this idea that everything is purely down to personal effort, that every employee earns exactly what they deserve based on how hard they work. And then the manager also steps up and says, gentlemen, whether you like it or not, your entire being, your body, your resilience, your energy, it's already set at 20 times the standard. Lowering the quota would mean lowering your efficiency, which I know you yourself would regret. I have full confidence that each of you will reach, no exceed, your targets. On the other hand, Pinneberg is faced with this dilemma, like Kracauer called it, that he has to show this morally pink complexion. So, and what he meant by pale, kindly distorted faces. And it was basically a symbol for how you should always reflect a rosy reality on your face when you are at work. Because of course, HR doesn't want employees to walk around with faces that show the strain and stress of their actual lives. And they expect you to hide all your existential worries under a mask of friendliness. So basically you have to put on a face and, to put it bluntly, play along with the whole thing. Just smile through the injustice. And I mean, what other choice does Pinneberg actually has? And at the same time, there is an economic crisis going on. People barely have any money, let alone the kind of money to go shopping in a man's fashion store. And in all of this, Lämmchen is actually the only one who sees the bigger picture, the only one who realizes that employees are being made to believe that everyone earns exactly what they deserve. And even though in reality wages are mostly dictated by the economy and people are completely at its mercy. So on the other hand, employees are expected to be endlessly productive, to work overtime constantly, but on the other hand, there's always some excuse to fire them, because if the economy isn't doing well and they need to cut stuff anyway, they can always just say, yeah, your performance has declined, instead of admitting that actually there are just fewer customers and fewer sales. And honestly, this situation for employees is just as bad today, if not even more relevant than ever, especially if you look at the gig economy and all these efficiency measures. You see how everything that employees fought for over decades is slowly crumbling. So bit by bit, it's all being undone as companies rely more and more on freelancers and expand short-term contracts. And actually, I have read the other day that McKinsey recently gave thousands of employees a bad rating. And the way it works is that if you get one of those ratings, you only have a few weeks to turn things around and prove them wrong. Otherwise, you're out. And it's exactly the same thing, because at the same time, McKinsey themselves admitted that they had hired too many people in recent years, but are now landing fewer projects. But instead of just being upfront about that, they'd rather come up with some excuse. And what I find even crazier though is that so many employees don't even question it. Instead, they just take on these internal rankings and quotas with open arms, almost seeing themselves as an extension of management. So they'd rather focus on individual effort and personal performance, even though deep down everyone must know that most people won't make it. But still they cling on this belief that if they just try hard enough, they can somehow save themselves. The unavoidable descent into poverty. So at this point, Pinneberg just can't meet his quota anymore. And then, we later find out there are also rumors going around about him. Because of that, he ends up getting fired from Mandel, which basically means he's hit rock bottom and he's now unemployed. And from there, things just keep going downhill. Lämmchen and he, along with little Merkel, have to move out because even their tiny old apartment, so the absolute cheapest they could find, is still too expensive for them. And eventually, through a friend of Pinneberg, they managed to get this tiny little place way out of the very edge of the city, and they start living off unemployment benefits. And so at this point, you really see it. They're not just living on the outskirts of the city, but also on the fringes of society itself. Lämmchen starts darning socks, and they try to make a little extra money here and there, doing any odd job that they can find, cutting corners whenever possible. So it just keeps getting worse. And yet somehow they still manage to shrink themselves down just a little bit more, save a little more, scrape by just a little longer. So there's really no happy ending here. And yet, as I mentioned before, the novel still does this incredible job of showing just how unbelievably respectful and loving they are to each other. It's honestly heartwarming to see how much they cherish one another as people, how even in the absolute hardest times they do everything they can to hold on to their love and their moral values. And even though they know this guy, so Pinneberg's mother's friend Jachmann, who's making tons of money through some shady business deals, and they see how easy it could be if they just gave up their principles, and yet they still choose not to. And personally, as a reader, I wouldn't have blamed them if they had, because the suffering they go through is just immense. But in the end, they make this conscious decision. They'd rather have nothing but their integrity and themselves, because that is something no one can take away from them. And that was Little Man, What Now? Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time here in the Literature Cafe.